evening, everyone. So, thank you so much for coming to tonight's program. My name is Liz Schultz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Oberlin Heritage Center. We're like the local historical society here. If you're not familiar with us, we are located in the middle of the block behind the post office or behind Lorenzo's, if you are familiar with Lorenzo's. So we're not part of the city or college, so a lot of our programs are made possible by members and contributors from the community. So if you're not a member and interested, we've got plenty of information over there. Our mission is to preserve and share the unique heritage of Oberlin and to make our community a better place to live, learn, work, and visit. Before I forget, we'll be kicking off our summer history walk season starting in early June. But just a little bit prior to that, there is commencement weekend, which is a big part of Oberlin College, but we also have public history walks that weekend too. So if you have any interest, check out our website, and we have a little flyer over there as well. There will be time for Q&A at the end of this program. If you just want to hang on to your questions, we'd be happy to answer them. And finally, we would appreciate feedback tonight. So you all had a feedback form on your chair. I know we did give you pens as well. There are pens up there, and you can see the little apple basket. That's where all the results can go at the end. Let me do a sound check. Is this okay for everyone? All right. Sorry, Liz.
Sounds like there's feedback.
Feedback. I'm just move it a little bit. I might be standing too close, so just read the room, Diana. You'll be great.
There's fan noise in the background. I'm not sure there's feedback.
That is true too. Yes.
But if there's, you could turn it down.
How's this for everyone? Well, as I get really close to it. Okay. So if you have issues hearing during the program, just wave your hand too. So our presenter tonight is Diana Steele, who has been a science writer for nearly 30 years and who is a resident of Oberlin. She is an avid birder and has birded in all 50 U.S. states and 6 continents. This program was actually planned for a few years ago, and even before then we exchanged some information about locations in Oberlin where we wanted to find out where some historic birding had taken place. So it was fun to be just a tiny little part of your research. So we are delighted to have her with us for the program tonight, sharing her knowledge of the birding world and this unique figure from Oberlin's past. So please join me in welcoming Diana.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. This program indeed was planned for a while back, but a lot of things got in the way. But I've been chugging away. I learn more every time I go to the library. Thanks, Roland. I'm going to answer, no, I have one more thing before that. I see some birders in the audience here, so don't try to answer this question. But we had a really high migration night, Sunday night, into Monday morning, with a lot of neotropical migrant birds flying over and into Lorain County from Central and South America, making that long journey with a tailwind. Anybody want to guess how many birds flew over Lorain County Sunday night? Migrants.
5,000.
5,000? Okay, more?
17,210.
That's a good guess. But more than that.
20,000.
More than that.
50,000 million.
Did I hear a million?
Yeah.
Who counted them?
Radar. They show up on weather radar. That was the estimated number of birds that passed over Lorain County Sunday night. And when I took this screenshot at 6:20 in the morning, there were still 15,000 birds in the air. Yeah. So anytime we have warm winds this time of year, they're from the south, and they're bringing those birds. And if you want to go birding with me, hit me up afterwards.
So that's not how Lynds Jones counted birds.
No, that is not how, and his name is pronounced Lynds. That is not how he counted birds, but he was very interested in bird migration and in taking the census of birds, so he would have found this absolutely fascinating.
Of that million, how many varieties?
That you can't estimate by radar, but
Did you estimate?
I would say over 100 different species. So I'm going to answer your first question first, before you ask it, which is how did I get interested in this topic? This was a Facebook post from 2018, and it's from my friend Ken Kaufman, who's a field guide author. And he said, the first big day anniversary is today. 120 years ago, these two guys from Oberlin did a big day where they counted more than 100 species in a single day, which is something birders still try to do. And I said to myself, why don't I know these people? I know nothing about them. Let me find the book that's written about them. And look, there's no book. There's a Wikipedia post, this sketchy outline, and it just made me more interested to learn about these people, particularly Lynds Jones. His son was George Jones. How many people here knew George personally? Yeah, a lot of you. Okay. George died in 1998 at the age of 100. But Lynds was his father. What I found out is that Lynds Jones has important legacies in 3 major areas. The first was ornithology. He was the first ever to teach a collegiate course in ornithology. That didn't exist 120 years ago, 130, 40 years ago. He founded the Wilson Ornithological Society, which still exists today. They have a journal, conference, a few thousand members. He founded the journal, which at the time was the Wilson Bulletin, now is the Wilson Journal of Ornithology. And he co-authored The Birds of Ohio in 1903. But he also leaves a legacy to recreational birding, perhaps even more impactful. Birding as a hobby didn't exist in the 19th century. The first Audubon clubs were formed to protect bird species, not for the enjoyment of birds. As I said before, he had the first big day, and this is many, many, many birders. If you know any birders, they'll have done a big day or know somebody who has. He conducted the first Christmas bird count, and I'll tell you more about the history of that. And he kept a list of birds wherever he went, as well as a life list. And that wasn't an activity that people did back then. And he published them in his journal, and he encouraged everyone to take a look around them and find out what birds were living near them, at what times of year, what migrants were passing through, and he just published people's lists of birds. Eventually, people got tired of it. They were like, the lists, they don't matter. And he conceded that perhaps they weren't worth space in the journal, but now we have an online database where people can keep lists in real time of birds all around the world, and it's incredibly useful to science and to other birders. He also leaves a legacy to ecology. He's one of the pioneers in the study of animal ecology. He had the first department of ecology anywhere, and he led some of the first ecology field trips, and I'm going to tell you about those too, because they were epic. And he mentored women in ecology at a time when women were not doing science. They were in the kitchen and taking care of the kids. I don't have many bird pictures in here, but I scattered a few in just to show you some of the birds that you can find in Lorain County this time of year. This one would be exceptional if you found it, but it has been seen in the last couple of days. It's a golden-winged warbler. In his legacy to ornithology, I'm going to start with his childhood. He was born in Ashtabula, Ohio, in January 1865. 1865 is crucial because his father was in the militia, but his mother wouldn't let him go to war. So he did not fight in the Civil War. And when the Civil War ended and all of his neighbors were coming home, war heroes, he got out of town and moved to Grinnell, Iowa. And that's where he raised his family on a prairie farm. When Lynds was young, one of his neighbors taught him how to collect and sell bird eggs. And this actually was a great help to the family because apparently his father wasn't that great a farmer and he had to hire out his children to help pay the mortgage. But Lynds really got into this bird collecting business, and by the time he came to Oberlin, he had amassed a collection of 250 species of birds through either collecting or trading. And I don't know if you can imagine what it takes to collect bird eggs, but I found a diary entry where he said, found great horned owl nest with 1 egg, left the egg. 3 days later he went back. Great horned owl nest had 3 eggs, collected eggs. Well, he skipped the part where he had to climb a tree like 50, 70 feet to even get to the nest. So the other thing is you can't collect eggs once they've started incubating because they have embryos in them. You want to collect them when they're freshly laid, and then you can blow them out and keep them. You can't do that now, by the way, it's illegal. But this is a sample of one of the clutches that he collected in Lorain County of an alder flycatcher, which is a bird that I don't know if it nests here anymore. So the Wilson Ornithological Society and the journal date back to 1886, essentially, when Lynds Jones and a bunch of his siblings and neighbors got together and formed a natural history club. And back in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, there was a national association named after Louis Agassiz called the Agassiz Association. And they had chapters. It was like Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. They had geographical local clubs. So the children of the Tallman, Jones, and Houghton families got together, I should say youth, and formed a club, and George Tallman was their advisor. He was the one who would encourage them to start the club because he was a teacher and he really enjoyed natural history. So in these clubs, the kids, the youth of this club tended to specialize in an area of interest, and for Lynds Jones it was eggs and bird migration. And they started this little big tabloid newspaper, which I found in the archives. It's handwritten, hand illustrated. I don't know how many copies were made because there's only one that's in the archives, and not too many of them are there. But they're pages long, handwritten, longhand, copied out. And they maintained a museum. Lynds was the curator of the Agassiz Association Museum. In 1887 is the first issue that I could find where Lynds Jones appears as an editor. And he pretty much was an editor for the rest of his entire life. On this, I just want to point out, this is from the journal that Agassiz Association nationally produced called the Swiss Cross. Can you see the cursor a little bit? Let's see. We have also derived great benefit from writing notes on our observations for scientific papers and would advise all AA members to follow this practice. I can pretty much guess that Lynds Jones wrote that sentence because that he spent the rest of his life encouraging other people to do observations in science and publish. And then in 1888, there was another chapter formed with the kids, relative younger siblings of those families plus other families that joined. And at the very end it says, we number over 20 members representing 7 families. We are all older than 5, and with one exception, all younger than 14. In 1888, Lynds Jones was one of the founders of an interest-based rather than geographic-based Agassiz Association chapter. And they began by publishing their own journal, which first issue, it went through several names in the first couple of years, but one of them was the Ornithologists and Oologists, that is the egg collectors, semi-annual. And they renamed it the Wilson Ornithological Society after American ornithologist Alexander Wilson. And the journal became the Wilson Bulletin in 1895, published quarterly with Lynds Jones as the editor. And in 2005, it was renamed the Wilson Journal of Ornithology, but essentially it's the same organ. In 1890-91, there weren't very many members of the club. They had subscribing members 15 entitled to vote, voting 11. They elected Lynds Jones for president, and he was also the secretary that recorded the votes and the acting treasurer. And he gave the president's message in this issue of the journal. This is all from one issue, which he edited. And here's another one of those amazingly beautiful, my favorite, spring warbler, blackberry warbler. I have not seen one yet this year. I will very soon. So Lynds grew up in Grinnell, and he studied at Grinnell College for 2 years, but he got frustrated because their curriculum was very classics-oriented. And he knew that he really wanted to study natural history. That was his passion, clearly. His wife's half-sister, Mary, was married to Giles Shirtliff, General Giles Shirtliff, who was then treasurer of Oberlin College. And he mentioned that there were many more courses devoted to science at Oberlin than Grinnell, and he might be better suited to studying here. So in 1890, he took the train to Oberlin, made money for tuition by chopping and stacking wood, and also collecting eggs. When he graduated, he was named curator of the Natural History Museum here at the college, which no longer exists, sadly. And he continued to collect eggs and bird specimens. And he got married that year to one of the fellow club members from the Agassiz Association. And his brother, Burton, also married Clara's sister. In 1892, he asked the college, hey, I'd really like to teach ornithology in addition to my museum curating duties. And the faculty were skeptical and said, we don't think anybody would be interested in that class, but we'll let you teach it and you can collect laboratory fees as your salary. And it was so popular that they formally added it to the curriculum in 1895. And it eventually became the most popular class at the college. And he had as many as 137 students. And he was famous for doing lots of lab work, i.e. field work, i.e. getting up early in the morning and wandering all about Marin County looking at birds. He continued his education, getting his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1905. He was acquainted with, I'm not sure to what degree, Henry Cowles, who was a student at the time that, at Oberlin, at the time that Lynds was here, and was already at Chicago as a professor of zoology or botany, I'm not sure, in 1905 when Lynds did his PhD. Does anybody know who Henry Cowles is? Okay. He's one of the early botanical ecologists, and he discovered the succession of plants by studying the Indiana dunes, and he wrote his PhD thesis on plant succession. which we now just take for granted. That's how the world is, that's how it works, but at one point we didn't know that. I'm going to talk about William Leon Dawson, who was the second person on that big day from 1897. He was a student of Lynds Jones, but he was studying theology, so he got his Bachelor of Divinity in 1899 and eventually moved out to Washington State and took a parish. But he was passionate about birds, and he was another big egg collector. And I think the inspiration for some of Lynds's most epic adventures. But Jones taught him how to listen to birdsong, which is, he knew how to identify birds by sight, he knew how to collect specimens, but he didn't know how to identify them by song. He moved to Washington and California, but they continued to correspond, at least through the journal. I really would love to find any of their letters. I've been looking. And his egg collection formed the basis of the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, which he founded. And he wrote Birds of Ohio, Birds of Washington, and Birds of California. In 1900, they took this amazing journey to the West Coast. It was the first time Lynds Jones had been past Grinnell. They took the train out west. Lynds Jones had a brother and sister in Pasadena, so he went down to Pasadena to visit his family, while Dawson went up to Washington, which is where he had his parish. They went across Lake Chelan together when they met up back again in Washington State by steamboat, and then they hiked in the mountains above Lake Chelan, collecting bird specimens on their way. But they had a little bit of a disaster. Well, you can see there, the guns here were for collecting birds. Collecting, I mean shooting and then preserving them. But one day when they were hiking, they had left their campfire a little too unattended, and a log rolled over onto their stuff. So it burned Lynds's return train ticket, much of their clothing, and destroyed their specimens. And because the specimens are preserved with arsenic, arsenic contaminated their food. So getting back, they had even more of an adventure, and they built a raft for themselves to float down the Skagit River, which they portaged around rapids. And they eventually made it down and told their tale to at the country store, and the people there didn't believe them. They said that couldn't happen. In 2 months, they traveled through 14 states, 7,000 miles. He kept track of all of the miles that he traveled by foot, by car, by train for his entire life, and saw 309 species. And then they each wrote a paper for the Wilson Bulletin. Dawson wrote up their adventures, and Lynds Jones wrote up their lists. As I said, they collaborated on the Birds of Ohio in 1903. The writing is mostly Dawson's, but Lynds Jones contributed to the catalog and helped with the publishing of the book. And he wrote an introduction. It's not a field guide. It's a big tome, actually 2 tomes, 671 pages, and it describes, I think, about 300 species. So you figure like 2 pages per species. And unfortunately, Dawson died before he could complete the revised edition that he was traveling in Ohio to do work on. I highly recommend, if you get a chance, to take a look either online or in the library at the writing in the Birds of Ohio, if you're interested in birds at all, because as I'll show you, the writing is amazing. He dedicated this book, Will Dawson, to his son, Will Oberlin, who was then about 3 years old, who was already approving himself in a fond father's eyes as a young ornithologist. In 1920, young Will Oberlin was a student at Oberlin, and Lynds wrote a letter to his wife, Clara, saying that Will Dawson has dropped the freshman Bible and come into my bird course. He said nothing to me about it until the deed was done, so I am not guilty. I don't know what his father will say. I guess that any lack of knowledge of the Bible on his part due to this change might well be laid to his father's door. And then he goes on to talk about the chores he had to do that afternoon, because at the same time as he was teaching ornithology and being a professor at the college, he was also farming. So he had to go haul some manure this afternoon. The piles are getting too large for comfort. Here's an excerpt from the Birds of Ohio. I'm just going to read part of it. This is a bobolink, which is a bird that is found in Lorraine County. It tends to be somewhat nomadic, so we don't always see it. But they have an amazing song. They sound to me like R2-D2, like a computer music sort of odd sound. But the way Will Dawson described it, oh, how they sing those bacchanals of springtime from fence post or treetop or quivering in midair. They pour forth such an ecstasy of liquid gurgling notes as must thrill the very clouds. I think he meant clouds. Such exuberance of spirit, such reckless abandon of the mirth-compelling joy would cure a sick creature on Blue Monday. Our field guides are not written like that anymore. It's unfortunate. The next Birds of Ohio didn't come along until 1989. I'm going to shift to recreational birding now. Has anybody seen the movie The Big Year? Yeah, a few people. It's my family's favorite movie, so if anybody ever becomes a friend of our family, they are sat down on the couch and forced to watch it. But usually they like it. It has Steve Martin in a not funny role. Anyway, it's a true story about a competition a number of years ago of birders trying to see as many species in I think it was in the United States and Canada in a single year. So it's what Lynds Jones would have termed a horizon, a senso horizon, encompassing a year rather than a day. And I already mentioned this big day, but the more I found out about this one, the more interesting it became. And Lynds Jones continued to do this. Dawson moved back to Washington State, but Jones went out every year in May. He'd pick a favorable day when there were nice south winds like we had Sunday night, and he would try to see as many species as he possibly could. I think he got up to 112 in one day, but he was the first solo bird watcher to see over 100 species in a single day. That was also in Lorraine County. But let's think about how they did that. So this is from his diary. Dawson and I went to South Woods at 3:15 a.m., stayed till 7:30, came home to breakfast, took 8:30 car, reached Lorraine at 9:45, walked over to Oak Point on the beach part of the way, then home cross country, reached home at 8:30 p.m., recorded 102 species. So they started in Oberlin, they walked down to the South Woods, which is now a preserve, thanks to Kate Palacky. It's the Oberlin Preserve / South Woods. And I bird there now. One of the other things that I found really interesting about Lynds Jones is how parallel our lives are a century apart. We sang in the same choir, we attended the same church, we bird in the same places. It's like he would have been my best friend if we'd been born at the same time. Anyway, he watched the South Woods, where I bird there now. Took the train, which we don't have anymore, to Elyria. I figure he walked at least 3 to 4 miles. Changed for Lorraine. Got off the train down by the, I think, Black River Landing. And then walked along to Oak Point, 4 miles, partly on the beach. I don't think you could do that anymore, or it wouldn't be very fun. And then returned from Oak Point across country. Now the Beaver Creek runs most of the way, and he mentioned several times about walking down Beaver Creek. So I presume that's kind of how they went. So they walked, I don't know, how many miles? I forgot. I did it. It was like close to 18 to 20 miles, perhaps, in a single day. And his son George said that Lynds walked even more than was typical for his time. And he did this quite often. In fact, he describes it in the journal as a great thing to do in winter. And he walked along the beach, and there were breakers being held back by ice floes, and he walked in the lee of the Beaver Creek to stay out of the kind of blizzard-like conditions that he was birding in. Now we have big days, big weeks, big years. By 1903, other people were publishing in the Wilson Bulletin their own big day lists. And now they're common individual pursuits, and they spawn competitions for Audubon chapters as a fundraiser. Biggest week in American Birding, which starts on Friday, out headquartered at Maumee Bay State Park, Northwest Ohio, is one of the largest birding festivals in North America. And as I already mentioned, the big year brought attention to the singular birding sport of trying to see as many species as possible, with no reward other than being published in the magazine. And, bragging rights. Now moving on to the Christmas bird count. Anybody here? Well, I know several people here who've done Christmas bird counts. Who knows what a Christmas bird count is? Okay, so a fair number of people. I'll just go through the history and then you'll understand what it is. In December of 1897, Jones and Dawson decided they wanted to take a census of the birds in downtown Oberlin. So they circumscribed a circle 3/4 of a mile in diameter centered on downtown, and then tried to count all the birds that they could find in that circle. And this is from his diary. Dawson and I took the bird census of 2/3 of town within the 3/4 mile limit. 16 species and 74 individuals, about 10,000 English sparrows, which we call house sparrows today. But you see, he noted the weather, which he did every day of his entire life, ever since he could write. And most of his diaries are in the archives, so if you want to look up the weather for a particular day, you can look it up in his diary. He published in the Wilson Bulletin with a little bit more descriptive language. The air still just sharp enough to give zest to outdoor life without discomfort, just bright enough to give activity to the birds. Such little things as high picket and wire fences, thorny hedgerows, inquisitive housekeepers, and threatened incarceration as lunatics are not to be considered. And then he encourages other people to do this, because winter is otherwise boring if you enjoy watching birds, because there aren't as many around, it's harder to get outside. This census taking, if given as much attention as the note taking which every lover of birds indulges in during the spring, will fill in the usual winter blank with notes second to none and point of interest. And he concludes, try it. In 1900, Frank Chapman wrote in his magazine, Bird Lore, which was the national Audubon publication, at that time was only in its second year, he invited people to count birds at Christmas time rather than shoot them, which was a popular sport at the time, and then publish their lists of birds in his magazine in the following February. And this was dubbed the first Christmas bird count. So if you look at bird count history, this past December was the 123rd, but if you think about the three that came before it, it really was the 126th. And now you know. So they eventually standardized these count circles. They still kept a circle. They're 15 miles in diameter, and they're located all throughout North and South America. It's incredible. It just has spread like crazy. And they standardized the circle so it's the same circle every year. It's counted on one day between a certain date in December and a certain date in January, which is a 3-week spread. By 1909, there were 200 people counting, And William Dawson in Santa Barbara had the first Christmas count of over 100 species. It was kind of his thing. In 1935, the Los Angeles Audubon counted 170 species during its Christmas census. I just learned, I was out in LA County last week, it's the birdiest county in the entire United States. By 1939, we were up to 2,000 observers and counting 2 million birds. And this past Christmas, 79,000 people, 2,600 count circles throughout the Americas, over 2,000 species, and 40 million birds, which sounds like a lot until you look at the data, which shows this is half as many birds as were counted 50 years ago. 50 years ago, there were half as many observers and half as many count circles, so I figure that's about a quarter as many birds now as there were back then, which is very concerning. And the Christmas bird count data is used to assess the health of bird populations and to guide conservation efforts. Switching gears now to ecology. I'm going to talk about Althea Sherman. Sid asked me about Althea before I started the talk this evening. She was a really interesting person and well acquainted with Lynds Jones. She graduated from Oberlin College in 1875, and she studied and taught art for many years before she moved home to Iowa to care for her dying parents. And then she stayed in that home the rest of her life, and she observed the birds from her yard. Posthumously, there was a book published called Birds of an Iowa Dooryard, her writings of the birds that she saw in her yard. And she published in journals, beginning with the Wilson Bulletin. So she sent a manuscript to Lynds Jones, which he then published. It was called Some Observations at Weed Seed Inn, which is just what she called her property at that time. And he was very encouraging of her ornithological pursuits, and in return, she was very encouraging of his position at Oberlin College. Now, when I first started looking at the archives a number of years ago, I pulled a box on Lynds Jones' correspondence with professional colleagues, and in there was a treasure trove of letters from Althea Sherman that were not indexed. Sorry, Roland, I don't know if you worked on that collection or not, but they were hidden in there, and I brought it to the attention of the archivist. Now they are indexed separately so that anybody can go look and find them. I've only started to dive into them. I just meant to say that Althea is best known for her studies of chimney swifts, and if you go to the south, to the Oberlin Preserve Prairie, which is on West Hamilton, there's a chimney swift tower there and a little infographic kiosk that explains about Althea Sherman and chimney swifts and how she studied them. And we built the tower. So here's one of the letters that Althea wrote, their voluminous correspondence. They knew each other from ornithological meetings and from journals. And she came to visit him in his office in December of 1906 and told him that she was, and this was like a year after he finished his PhD at Chicago, and she said she was very concerned about his future at Oberlin College and wanted to make sure that he stayed there and kept teaching ornithology because it was very important to her. So she started a campaign to endow a professorship in ornithology at Oberlin College. She pledged $600 to this campaign, plus an additional $100 that she had had designated for the general fund. She said, now I want this to go to the seed money for this professorship. So I hope, she writes, I hope the subject connected with the welfare of Oberlin College, in which I have been deeply interested, is being satisfactorily settled. I have tried to do all I can according to the light afforded me. I have urged the matter upon the trustees and alumni as I have met with them. All agree with me as to what is best for Oberlin, and I think we shall secure her best interests if you can afford to wait. In April, I visited in Minnesota, in Northfield. I found all my friends were studying birds. This means that in a few years, our colleges will give more attention to the study, and Oberlin ought not to lose her leading position in the work being done in that line. So for several years, I guess 1906, 7, 8, she continued to lobby for this professorship, but the faculty were skeptical that it would work, and it never came to fruition. But she still had the $600 that she had pledged. So and now I don't know how this title came about, but he was named Associate Professor of Animal Ecology, and she paid a third of his salary. So the college was paying him $1,200, and she pledged the $600 that she had wanted for the professorship in ornithology to his work that year. He did not get along with the chair of zoology, who thought that ornithology was sort of a silly pursuit, as was ecology. And so he had an autonomous sub-department that offered its first major in 1915. Now, I don't know how he decided that he wanted to be called an animal ecologist. But as I said, he knew Henry Cowles at Chicago, who was a plant ecologist. And when he told Althea about this title, she said, I have only the vaguest notion what ecology is, but could you tell me more about it? In 1922, he got tenure, and now he has a separate Department of Animal Ecology, which was the only such department in the United States. Unfortunately, the college did not remain progressive, even though they were popular courses by all accounts, and they dropped the department and ecology classes and ornithology classes in 1930 when he retired. Althea, as I said, was a great observer of the nature in her backyard, and she was very curious about how species nested. And this paper she published in the Wilson Bulletin in 1910 was a 2-year study she did of nesting flickers. She built nest boxes in her barn that had a little flap on the back of them so that she could climb up a ladder and open the flap and take out the nestlings. And as you can see in this chart, she weighed them every day, the eggs, the nestlings. She did this for 7 broods, there were 7 chicks in that brood, 1908, and then she did it again in 1909. And she wrote this paper. Initially, she was planning to give it, and I think she did, to the American Ornithological Union meeting where she would read the paper. But she sent it first to Lynds, saying, I would really appreciate your feedback on this manuscript, as I don't know, I'm not a trained ornithologist, I don't know what anyone knows about flickers. But spoiler alert, basically, they didn't know any of what she knew about flickers. And in continuing his campaign to encourage others to engage in the type of study that he thought was important, he wrote this introduction to her paper. If we properly interpret the particular function of the Wilson Bulletin, which is he was interested in the study of birds in their living environment, not the study of how birds were related to each other, which was the focus of ornithology before that. People were very concerned with the morphology, anatomy, and relatedness of birds, and less with how they interacted with their environment. Now we just take that for granted. Of course you study living organisms in their environment, but not them. This paper accurately typifies it. While there is a certain value to the detection of slight differences in the plumage of our North American birds from museum specimens, and perhaps a necessity for giving names to groups of individuals showing the differences, it remains for the careful student of the living birds to detect the causes for such variations. Of the two fields of study, it must be clear to all that the study of the living bird and its environment is much the more necessary. The Bulletin has consistently urged upon its readers the earnest pursuit of field studies and takes this opportunity to again urge it. We must know more about the living bird before we can expect to assign him his proper place in the world of taxonomy, as well as the world of conservation in all of its aspects. Our imperfect knowledge makes any system of taxonomy admittedly tentative. If we read this paper aright, we will detect all along between the lines a devotion to the study in hand which spells an enormous amount of labor. Try it if you don't believe it. And she provided all her own illustrations and photographs for this article. Also, did I mention that she didn't understand what ecology was? Yeah, okay, so basically she was doing ecology without knowing it was ecology. He led some of the first student ecology field trips ever. Starting in 1910, he was really interested in having students study southward migration of birds, and so he had a group of students he took up to Point Pelee, which is the part of Canada that extends down into Lake Erie. Kind of in the fall, the birds funnel down over land until they can't be on land anymore, and then they make the leap over to the Lake Erie Islands or to the lakefront. So, indeed, he found that that was a very important place for migration, and his students took a lot of data. And starting in 1915, he decided that he wanted to go out to the West Coast, probably at Dawson's urging, and Dawson went along on some of these trips. The initial 2 trips took place by train. Starting in 1919, they were by automobile. And I was astonished when I looked at the photographs and the rosters of who went on these trips, how many women participated. In particular, I'm going to highlight 2 of them because they kept incredible journals and photographic albums of the excursion. So this is from 1915, a woman named Enid Bancroft Sutton, and she has absolutely beautiful photographs, and this is her. And included in her journal is just this map of their travel. So they took the train to Seattle, and then they boarded a steamship or a yacht, I'm not sure, the SS Bellingham, and traveled up across the top edge of Washington State in the Strait of San Juan de Fuca, and ended up at this point, which is Nia Bay, which is on a Native American reservation. And there they boarded ocean-going canoes and traveled along the coast, stopping at, these are their little campsites that she's marked, and they studied birds on their offshore islands, which is where they're nesting. They also went by horseback, they hiked, they camped on the beach, and they fished for their food. So here, as I mentioned, is a photograph of all the people on the trip. There's like 9 women in this picture. Again, this is Enid. Can you guess who? This is their departure from Nia Bay in this ocean-going canoe. That would have been fun. And here it is landing. A hard landing picture fails to show how rough it was. Professor Jones in the kitchen. This is an example of like one of the pages from her photograph album. She really took a lot of photographs of birds, considering it was 1915 and she was carrying around like a pocket camera. I love this one. She titled it "Too Close for Beauty." This is a California myrrh colony. And here's the camera. I'm not sure who is holding this captured tufted puffin. And she's, in her journal, she has separate chapters for each of the species of birds that they encountered. So white-crested cormorant. I thought the chicks of the glaucous-winged gull were just incredibly cute. The 1916 trip was by train, and then World War I interrupted, and there weren't field trips for a couple of years. But in 1919, Lynds decided to buy automobiles and travel west that way because they have a little more flexibility, a lot more flexibility in where they could go, and they could stop in places that the train only passed by. So I think that first year they bought 4 automobiles. George, who some of you know, was the assistant leader and chief mechanic. This picture is of what they call a 1-ton truck from the 1920 field trip. I'm not sure how long the 1-ton truck lasted because they had trouble driving it even in the streets of Oberlin because they weren't paved and it was really hard to drive it because it was so heavy. And there weren't really roads out west either. Typically, they would drive the cars out to the west coast and try to sell them and then come back by train. If they couldn't sell the cars, then they'd have to drive them back. And altogether, there were 13 of these epic adventures. One was all women. Most of them were more women than men. Now I'm going to talk about the 1922 trip because there's a great journal and photo album from that year that was kept by Grace Cowley in Berlin, who later became, she was one of the first women to graduate with a degree in ecology. In that year, 1923, there were 3 graduates from animal ecology from Oberlin College, and they were all women. She became an ecologist, ornithologist, and historian in Toledo. And this is from her journal of the trip, which she submitted for a grade and received only a B+. It was like a 90-page typed paper with photos. So this is the route that they took, and then she was, I think, assigned the task of tracking the vegetation. So this is what her paper is mostly about. Enid's was mostly, not all, but mostly about the bird life. So on this map, it shows traveling through the beech maple forest on down to the coastal chaparral and how it changes as you go west and south. They dipped down to Pasadena to visit relatives. They passed through Utah and picked up Lynds' brother Marcus, who was a botanist. This is just an example paragraph from her journal. Again, describing the woodland climax formation and pinyon cedar association, pine oak, creosote bush and grasses, and this beautiful Joshua tree with the group standing underneath. I have a better version of that picture, and I'll show you who's in the photo. You can imagine with cars came a lot more problems, especially in the 1920s. So they ran out of gas in Bryan, Ohio, June 23rd. They had a flat tire in Montana, July 5th. 4 days later, fixing another puncture. Beautiful roads they're onto. And no railroads, no bridges, so they're fording the Virgin River after rain, bill pushing. August 19th, George replaces a connecting rod on his car, and Genevieve, Ted, Harold, George, and Louise were all supervising apparently. Springs broke, batteries died, generators died, connecting rods, tires, rollovers, you name it, it happened, and often. George did say the cars got better over the years, which was one reason to sell them after the journey, so that he could buy new ones for the following year. What was interesting about the photographs was noting how similar photographs of landscapes are from what we would take today, Badlands, Cedar Breaks. I've been in both those places. They look just like that today. But the photographs of the people are really different. So here's Greta Penfound on the trail. Here's a group under the Joshua tree. Gladys, Greta, Grace, Louise, Genevieve, and then George and Lynds Jones. Resting after coming up from the lower falls, Greta, Joel, Genevieve, Gladys, George, Homer. They had fun too. Seaweed swimsuits. This is one of the only pictures of Grace that is in the photo album because she took most of the pictures, but I really like this one because it's so active. And here's Lynds in the background. Almost to the end. We'll talk a little bit about his children because I've already mentioned George. The oldest, Lynds Leo, became an electrician and lived in New Orleans. The second son, Theodore Burton Jones, died in what I think must have been a farming accident where he had an aneurysm. He was farming, haying with his father, and he ran up to Lynds and complained that he had a really bad headache and he couldn't see. And he collapsed and died at the hospital. George Tolman Jones graduated from Oberlin in 1920 with a degree in animal ecology, studying under his father. He became a botanist and taught at Oberlin from 1924 until 1963, and is still remembered for weekly ecology walks every Sunday afternoon, which some of you have gone on. He died only 6 years before I came to Oberlin. Interestingly, he did not publish a scientific paper during his lifetime. He collected tens of thousands of botanical samples, and he collected enormous amounts of material for the archives on his family. He wrote an 800-page typed manuscript biography of his father, which is a day-by-day account, year-by-year, all in chronological order of exactly what Lynds did every day, like shifting manure piles or starting the Department of Ecology. And you have to kind of sift through all the material to find the gems. And it's not even organized by year. So when I find something interesting, I'm like, okay, wait, what year is that? And I scroll back, okay, note it in the text for myself. He also wrote an autobiography of more than 4,000 typed manuscript pages, which if you were to take and publish in book form, I figure would be about 18 volumes. So I have not dared to begin reading that. Eventually, maybe I will. Beth Jones, the only daughter, married into the biology community. One of Lynds' students, Max DeLaubenfels, and he became a world-renowned spongiologist and expert in marine sponges. And then their son, Lynds' grandson, became a biogeographer specializing in the taxonomy of conifers. So they kind of passed down this legacy of like intense interest in the living environment. Harold Charles, the youngest here, was also a biologist and taught at Berry College in Georgia. One year, Lynds went out, after he retired from Oberlin, Lynds went out and taught Harold's classes because Harold was in graduate school. And Lynds decided that the students at Berry College really deserved to have his egg collection because they had so few resources. So he donated his entire collection of, I don't know how many eggs, how many species, to Berry College. The news media dubbed him the Birdman, which is where I got the title for my talk. But they didn't always get the spelling right. I think the headline writer wasn't sure that Birdman was really appropriate or something. This is a picture that appeared in Wilson Bulletin in 1938 of Lynds with his 54th Ford automobile, He settled on Fords after trying a bunch of different varieties, makes and models of cars. And the next year, he bought his 55th Ford, and there's an article in the News Tribune, or at least a photograph in the News Tribune that I haven't dived into the microfiche to pull up, but when I do, I'll also include that photo. That's all I have to say about Lynds Jones and the Jones family. I do want to point out that there are a couple of Sundays left for bird walks in Lorain County at the Oberlin Preserve, Southwoods Park at the recreation fields on West Hamilton at the west end of the lot, and meet the leader there. Greg Eldred is leading all but May 12th, which is me. We walk south on the Ramsey right-of-way and pass a really interesting wetland, a great horned owl nest, and we'll see some very cool birds, I'm sure. And at Vermilion River Reservation, Bacon Woods, at the same time, on Sundays, May 5th, 12th, and 19th, Josh Vargas and Ed Bransky will be leading walks there. So if you're interested in following up, come on out. If you have binoculars, great. If you don't, I'll try to scare and prepare for you. And we'll definitely get you some good birds to see. All right. Any questions?
Thank you so much. I think we'll have time for, pardon me, just one or two questions, and then those of you who would like to can remain behind as well.
I just want to share something about George Jones. I came to Oberlin in 1983, so he was long retired. But he came to the Science Library very often and was very faithful in donating his copy of Scientific American, which is the only reason we had Scientific American. And I was thanking him one time. I said, "This is really wonderful that you are able to part with it." And he said, "I can't read it anymore. It's too technical."
Yes.
This is a story that George told me, that he was with one of his father's ecology trips across the country on the Model Ts, he said.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one man who cursed a lot. If he didn't like the weather, he would say, "This damn weather." If he didn't like the food, he'd say, "This fucking food." Almost every word, almost every sentence he said had a curse word in it. This man was changing, had a flat tire on his Ford and was changing it, and the car fell off of the jack and landed on his foot. And he ran up and down the road saying nothing because he had already used up all of his nasty words.
I forgot to say that when Lynds bought his first car, he'd only ever driven boats before, which you steer the opposite way of the car. So when he first got in the car, when he wanted to turn right, he turned the steering wheel left, and he almost went into a ditch a couple of times before he got it right. Tim.
I wonder if I showed the photographs with the shotguns and guns. It was a common practice, of course, to take blood species back then. I wonder with all the information that came around the turn of the century, whether you read anything in your research about him regretting any of the taking, or was he satisfied that the scientific basis for his collection was still appropriate?
I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know if there is any material in the letters where he wrote about that or in the journal. It would require a little bit more time reading through stuff. As far as I know, he never regretted it, but
Did you discontinue the practice?
I don't know the answer to that question either. I assume that he did unless he got a federal permit for it after the International Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I do know one story that he collected a Kirtland's warbler in the Southwoods in 1900. before anything was known about where the Kirtland's warbler nested. And I don't think there's been a Kirtland's warbler seen in Lorain County since. And it is an incredibly rare bird. It got down to a level of about 400 individual birds in the 1980s before people really discovered how to conserve the birds. I figure I could have walked around with 2 shopping bags full of all of the Kirtland's warblers in the 1980s if I could find them all in one place. Even now, I could fit them all in my car and they would have room to fly around. So there's a Kirtland's warbler here at Oberlin College in the biology building, and that's from the South Woods in 1900. You can go check it out. It's a little beat up, but still really interesting.
I was just gonna say, I'm in the biology department, and I don't know the origin of all the birds, but we do have a large collection of taxidermy birds that have been there for a long time. And they're being very actively taken care of and maintained, and they're in glass cases, but they come out for ornithology classes.
Mhm.
So they're still being used today. And, you know, we aren't collecting anymore, but the ones that we have, we figured might as well be seen and used.
There are lots of birds collected still, mostly from window strikes. My child goes around and picks up window strikes in Cleveland now, at Cleveland State. They used to be donated to the Natural History Museum, and there was a taxidermist there who would skin them and put them in the storage for study. I saw her last night, actually. She came, I gave this talk last night to a group of Rhodes Scholar travelers up in Putin Bay, and she was there. And at the end, she said that there are a lot of Lynds Jones's specimens at the museum in cold storage. And I'd be interested to go see what's there. And a lot of his collection, I was told, was sold to Ohio State. It's too bad that there isn't more here. I think everything that had specific information about where and when it was collected and by whom was sold to another collection. The ones that remain here are the ones that don't have information attached to them. I was able to reunite the Kirtland's warbler with its information, so I know when and where it was collected and by whom. Yes?
Final question.
I was wondering, you mentioned his farm. I was wondering where the farm that Lynds Jones lived.
So, for part of the time he was at Oberlin, he would take his family to Birmingham in the summer to camp on this man's farm. And there's some really nice photographs of the camp, tent, and they spent a couple, probably 8 weeks up there in the summer before he started doing these ecology field trips. And eventually he bought that farm. It backs up to the Vermilion River, and he farmed, it was about 100 acres. He farmed that for a number of years and took the train, the interurban train, to Oberlin to teach his classes. He eventually sold that farm and moved to Oberlin and bought the house down the street from you guys at 352 West College Street. And apparently there was either more land attached to that property or it was a separate property that he farmed just to the west of that. But even that house is on a couple of acres and had a lot of gardens behind it. He was well known for his corn. People sought him out for seed corn because of his selective breeding practices. All right.
Thank you again so much for sharing your knowledge and research with us tonight. Appreciate it.
Thank you for being my guest.